Hi everybody, I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Maine State Library. And tonight I'm going to talk about census substitutes. And basically these are records that take the place of a census that either wasn't done or, much more commonly, where the records have been lost. So let me show you some of what is going on and why you would need these. So let me share my screen. So this is a table for New Jersey showing the years of the federal census and the types of census done each year and whether they exist, or as you can see here, the first 4 federal censuses for New Jersey, except for one county 1 year, have all been lost. And so the first existing New Jersey federal census is for 1830, although the industrial manufacturers exists for 1820. So what these census substitutes hope to do is fill in this slot here. The other thing that happened, as many of you know, the 1890 census, except for about 6,000 names, has also been lost. And so the other time you get censuses are for trying to reconstruct where people were in 1890. So what kinds of records are we talking about? Well, the 2 primary ones are tax lists and city directories. But some of the other things that people will use to try to reconstruct who was living in a particular place at a particular time, you have maps. Many of you have probably seen the maps from the late 1800s and on that have the name of the homeowner. You get voting lists or electoral rolls called different things depending on when they are. There were places that at least a county-wide, if not statewide, did a school census. And so they did a census of all the families that had children in that had school-age children. You get militia lists, especially for earlier on, pre-American independence. You get people who, lists, especially of men, and you also get what were called freeman lists in New England, where they were men who were members of the church and eligible to vote and various other qualifications. Now, none of these lists takes the place of a complete census. Some of them come close to the early censuses where you only have the name of the head of the household. But a lot of them do some work in trying to rebuild these first 4. So let's take a look. Here's another state, Virginia. The entire 1790 census is lost. In 1880 or in 1800, only 2 counties are still in existence. In 1810, 17 counties are missing. And so, for example, with the 1790, there's an attempt to look at various lists of people from 1782 to 1785 as a way of if not completely reconstructing who was there in 1790, at least having a level of some aspect of that. And so this was printed by the federal government printing office. So, and plus it's also old enough now, it's out of copyright, but we can look, you can look at it at several places. This is the copy that's at the FamilySearch.org. If you look in the in their catalog, and let's get all the way into somewhere here. Here we go. You start to get some the population statistics. Exist still from the census, but not the names. So when we go, so here's a list from Amelia County in 1782 that gives you just the number of people who were white and people who were black. That was the only breakdown. And so you can make some guesses about some of these. There's a good chance that the ones with a fairly high number of African Americans were bigger plantations. If you see one, and I saw one when I was looking earlier, that had only people who were black and nobody who was white, it was probably somebody who was a free black. You'll notice some of these are listed as the estate of. So you can then guess that this Thomas Bevel, or Beville, I'm not sure how that name would be pronounced, had died by the time of, by 1782. And what's interesting is these, when I showed you that page a few back, it had the list of the assistants who did the tracking. And you'll see here, these are by that person's name within the county rather than by other geographic divisions. So it places somebody in the county, and I think those lists had who, where in a county they were, or you can figure that out from other records, like looking at deeds and wills. So that's one example of a census substitute. Again, you see Georgia, the first 3 censuses were lost except for one county, and then in 1820, 3 and a bit counties are missing. And then there are some stray 1890 records that still exist. So there is this book that you can get various places. We don't have it here at the State Library, but you could get it on interlibrary loan if you were interested in Georgia, that lists various substitutes within a few years of 1790. So that's one of, oh, I've got one more here to show you. So this is Delaware. They'd only lost 1890 and the one here in 1790, plus the industrial and manufacturers from 1810. But again, there's this book available, this is at Family Search in their books category, and there's a link to this from the catalog. So if you looked for Delaware census, there would be a link to this. And again, you get a lot of stuff at the beginning. And you get explanations. It's always good on these to read the explanations, because that way you have a much better idea of what it does cover and what it doesn't. And one of the things you end up doing with regular censuses, but especially with these, is figuring out if somebody isn't in the census or in the substitute, is it because they weren't covered as part of whatever documents were used to generate this, or is it a sign that they've moved to somewhere else? So, is it negative evidence, in other words? So if you're expecting somebody to be in Newcastle County, Delaware in 1790, and they're not in this list, does that mean that they've died, they've moved away, or does it mean that they didn't meet whatever qualifications went into the lists for that were used to generate these substitutes? So for example, with the militia lists, it's men who are generally between the ages of 21 and 60. And so you can, to some extent, watch men age into the militia, say in colonial Massachusetts or Rhode Island, and then 40 years later, you may get them age out. But what if they disappear after 25 years? Well, maybe they moved away, maybe they died, maybe they have some sort of disability so that they're no longer able to walk, and so they've been left off. But on the other hand, if you're looking at a militia list and it's the year, your ancestor would have been 65 and he's not there, if the militia lists end with men who turn 60 and they then age out, your ancestor not being there at 65 isn't a sign that there's something else going on. Does that make sense to everybody? Why, you should always read the directions on any of these things, but particularly something like the reconstructed censuses, where they're taking names from, in many cases, an array of sources. It's really important to figure out whether somebody's missing for a reason or if they're missing because they didn't qualify. I've seen lists like this where they've reconstructed the census, but only for men. And if there were women who were widows who were the head of the household, they might have been in the tax list, but they're not put into the compiled substitute. Because, and that was one of the decisions made when they decided to do the compilation. So again, that's a good thing to, are there widows listed in something that's otherwise men, like a tax list? So that's the good news on that, and sort of the bad news that it's not trying, many of the original records these are coming from are not trying to capture everybody the way a census does. So in Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts Big Colonies, I said, you had men who took the freeman's oath, and they would have been free white men, members of the church, the local parish church. But again, you get, and this is one of several where you get, it's been printed, you'll see they've even put the card catalog, the old style card catalog card here. And here you get information about the oath, what it said, who was eligible, and then you get, and this one's nice because you get the person's name, the date they took the oath, and in some cases, the town they were living in, which is nice, unlike that Amelia County, Virginia one where you just had the county. And so you have some interesting things, like here you have Ferdinando Adams, which is not a name you would expect in Massachusetts in the 1600s. So this covers most of the 17th century in Massachusetts, and it gives you that there will be other records for these men if they're in the Freeman's List. They won't have always owned land, but most of them will have. They will have joined the church. So they may be listed in church records such as pew rents and things like that. And you do get cases where you get distinguishing between a junior and a senior, which may help you figure out those relationships. Or you get cases where you have, here are two men named Edward Adams who took the Freeman's Oath just a few years apart. One's in Medford and one's in Medfield. And so this clues you in that you may find that there are two men who have had their records sort of merged because people weren't careful about keeping track of that there were multiple men with the same name. You also get a John Adams in Cambridge in 1666 and another John Adams in Cambridge in 1668. And so I'm guessing that if both of those men left descendants, that you will have to make sure that you are getting the right John Adams of Cambridge in your family tree, because I'm guessing that that was not necessarily, people don't always do the best job they can with distinguishing two men of the same name. So that, again, this is online, this printed version at Family Search in the books category. There are some handwritten copies of these in New England Town Records as well. So one of the other, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Ireland, because that's another place where all of the censuses pretty much before 1900, so up to 1891, no longer exist. Some were destroyed in the Irish Civil War in 1922. Others have been pulped by the British during World War I for the war effort. And when you combine that with the fact that most civil registration in Ireland didn't start until 1864, you've got a gap of records there that, especially for those who had ancestors leave Ireland during and in the aftermath of the potato famine, being able to connect to where your ancestor who shows up in Liverpool or Glasgow or Nova Scotia or Boston in the 1850s back to where they came from in Ireland. So there are three things that are normally used as census substitutes in Ireland, and none of them capture everybody. And I'm going to start actually with the most recent, which gets the most people. It was called Griffith Evaluation. It was done right after the famine, or sort of at the end of the famine through 1864. It's in many ways the most comprehensive data on Ireland until you start getting civil registration in 1864. And the nice thing is you can sometimes then tie people from civil registration, marriages, deaths, and so on, back to people in Griffith's Evaluation. And what this is doing is it was looking at that valuing land for tax purposes. So let's take a look at one, and I covered this more both in the maps presentation and in my Ireland presentation. So I'm just going to show this quickly. But if we look at this, you get the name of the person occupying a property, you get the county, you get the parish, and if you click on this, you get the name of their landlord, and then you get the detail down to the level of the town land, and then you get a link to where this is on a map. And so if we do this and we click on the map view, we'd have to, let me just double check on the number here. We need position 38. And this takes a minute. But this is nice because it's catching people after the famine. And so you're able, and you can see here, this is the area. And somewhere here, there's a little number 38. And I'm not going to go through and find it. You can do this over here and mostly see the modern map. And then go back to the historic map and find the piece of property. So you can see where the person you're looking for is living. And again, this is only going to capture the name of the renter. But it's still, it's the biggest look at the Irish population in the middle of the 19th century. So that's Griffith's valuation that's available multiple places in the printed volume and with this map at askaboutireland.ie. Then 30 years before that, well, 20 to 40 years before, in the 1820s and 30s, you had what were called the tithe allotment books. And these were, again, they were for taxes to support the Church of Ireland. So they called it a tithe, but it was still essentially a task. And this, again, does not get everybody. A lot of land was exempt. Other people were exempt. But let's take a look at what these look like. And I'm at the National Archives of Ireland, so webpage. So there's no Northern Ireland counties here. You'd have to go to the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. So let's look here at, no, it doesn't really matter. Let's take this one. And then these are the townlands in this parish. And then we can click here, and here you have the people living on this townland. And if we click through, and this has also been printed up. So if you get one where it's kind of hard to read, you can find a printed version online as well. But you get the name of the landholder, you get the bits of land. They rank the land by quality, and the tax varied based on that. So again, you're able to see the names of the people and to get an idea how they were doing compared to their neighbors. And so, this person had just under 6 pounds on their valuation, and then this family had 5 or just under 4, and this family has 25 pounds. So this family has more land and or much better land than the other 2 families on the page. But again, it can begin to help you figure out where in a county somebody was, particularly if you have a name that's not that common. I mean, there are places in Ireland that, if you have somebody, your Murphy or Sullivan shows up in Boston in 1850, if you don't have much more than that, you're going to be stuck. But if you have an unusual name, like I used Glass in the Griffith Evaluation, you may be able to narrow down where, even, certainly to a county and even more within the county where they were. The other one that happened for Ireland is in 1796. There was an award based on the number of acres of flax grown to get spinning wheels, and people who planted a whole lot were then able to get a loom, which makes sense. And so you can search here, and let's do, and this one covers, you'll see this one is not at a government website. This is at an Irish genealogy website. And so it has the Irish county, the counties in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland at the same website, which is handy. And so here in Tyrone in 1796, these are the people who planted enough flax to be given a spinning wheel. And again, this may or may not really be good information, but one of the other things that's really nice is you can start to search, like if we search Ulster, which is the northern counties, you can begin to see where this name was common. And so you can see that in those northern counties that are part of Ulster, it's looking like it's Tyrone is where most of the people named Arthur were. And so that can be helpful, even if you can't tie any one particular of these people to your family. It at least gives you a target of where to start looking. You can also just look by the whole county. So we can go here and look for the entire list of Tyrone, which if you look here, I'm scrolling down. One of the things to notice here is the way they get around the MAC versus MC it's just M apostrophe for all of them. And some of those were probably done that way in the original record. That's often how it's done in handwritten records, is M apostrophe. So that's some of what you can find for Ireland. And just because I know about these and I think they're interesting, this is a website called Scotland's Places, and it's a companion to the website Scotland's People. And most of this was done because the Ordnance Survey, which is the British equivalent of the USGS maps, they wanted to be able, they have these name books where they've done as they did the early Ordnance Survey maps in the 19th century, they had lists of every name of a geographical feature. And so they were digitizing those. But what's interesting is, in addition to that, if we click on records, they have some records here that are very interesting. And for our purposes, it's these tax records. And these records are nice because they often get you just a bit further back. You know, if you have civil registration started in Scotland in 1855. So if you have someone in your family who died not long after that, and it lists their parents may well end up in one of these late 18th century tax records. So so they taxed carriages, clocks and watches, dogs. They taxed female servants and male servants separately. There was a window tax. And so if we click into one of these, let's do the horse tax. And so most of these people, and you can see it tells you what geographic areas are in which volume. So let's take a look here in this one. And let's take Selkirk. And did I pick one that is, here we go. So you have by parish, this is the carriage and horse tax. So it tells you that John Pringle of Heinen had 6, and so he paid £3. And you get others where they've got 1. Here there's 1 person in the parish who has a horse. So here's Yarrow, where you have, you know, Robert Laidlaw of Peel and Robert Gibson of Fanrow, it looks like. And so you're getting people put in a place, which is essentially what you want for a census. Some of these, if we go further back, come on. So for example, the window tax is going to catch a fair number more people than the horse tax. So here's, let's take a look in Midlothian, which is Edinburgh and surrounding. So if we click here and choose a somewhat random page, you get, again, the scroll on this is, so again, we've got Stowe Parish, and you've got the name of the person and the number of windows, and then how much they would have. So here you have the people who have 9 windows, the people with 10, and then here's the tax they're paying. It's the duty on their windows and on the house. And so again, it shows you, and what I always think is interesting on this one is they do 7 through 13, they've got 14 to 19, and then 20 to 24, and then 25 and upwards. Why they chose to suddenly lump 14 to 19 together, I need to look into, because there's got to be a story behind that. And then The female servant tax rolls are also interesting. Let's go back to, and so in this case, and one reason I like these a lot is you'll notice that you get the woman's name in many cases, which again, for those of us looking, many of these would have been women who were young and working before they got married. And so it gives you a place where they are. And this is actually Shetland, not. And there was a number they could have with, you can see the, that the tax went up the more servants you had. So if you had one servant, you didn't pay, you paid 2 shillings 6 pence, but for 3 or more servants, you paid 10 shillings each. So this is nice that on this you do get some of the female servants' names, which can be something that's very nice to get. And as I said, that it's this whole series of taxes. Now there's this one that, a couple that are earlier, but most of them are in the second half of the 18th century, which means that you're getting close to where, with census records starting in 1841 and civil registration starting in 1855, that with those and some parish registers in the early 1800s, you can tie these in to records you found elsewhere. So that's a very handy thing. The other thing for Scotland, there are valuation rolls for Scotland, and this is Scotland's equivalent of Griffith's valuation. And what they've done, they have them for the years ending in 5/6, because in the UK, the census is done in the years ending in 1. So this is aiming to catch people halfway between the censuses. So it's a substitute in the sense that since they didn't do the census every 5 years, this gives you the chance to maybe catch somebody in between. So here we're in South Leith, which is now part of Edinburgh, where you get the description. So you have a dwelling house, a shop, offices, and then dwelling houses. The addresses, so we have Old Sugar House Close. This first building is owned by James Chalmers. And then you get a block here that, and I'm guessing what this is there's one that's the address around the corner on Tolbooth Wynd, and then you get a couple offices on the first floor and then tenement apartments above. And you get this John Adam owning this block. And then you get who's actually renting from the owner. So you have the Leith Property Investment Company. This one's empty. And then you have Robert Thompson, Robert Petrie, and so on, renting. And then who's actually occupying the premises. And there are times that you will have 3 different names. It'll be owned by one person, rented by somebody else, and then the tenant is actually subletting to the occupier. And this gives you an idea of the yearly rent. So this one here that's a shop, you can see the rent there at 34 pounds is considerably more than either the offices at 10 and 15 or the dwellings at 5 to 8 pounds per dwelling unit. But you'll notice that this gives you their address, their name, and unlike some of these other things I've shown you, it gives you an occupation which can help you figure out, do you have the right Robert Thompson or the right Alexander Chisholm? And so this is quite a handy thing to have, and it will show you when things are vacant. Here's a James Jameson that I was looking for. That's my great-grandfather's adopted father. You will get women's names generally if they're a widow. Here you'll see one that the other reason I pulled this one up, because I thought this was interesting. First of all, you get a stable, and then you have an office, vault, warehouse, and cellars to owned by, I have to go way up here. Oh, it's still old Sugar House Close. So it's owned by James Cathcart's heirs. And it's occupied by James Cathcart and Ferguson and Company wine merchants. So it's a wine merchant, and they're paying 80 pounds a year. Whereas, even up here, we saw the other shop at the grocer at 34. So there's a good chance the wine merchant's doing a pretty good business there if they're able to pay that rent. So this can be very handy if you're looking at 19th century Scotland. And some of these exist for other parts of the UK as well. But they're that nice little slice between the every 10-year census. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point. So a lot of it, once you've identified a place that you think your ancestors were living, and you've identified that there isn't a regular, ordinary US or UK census that exists for that time and place, what you have to do then is figure out what does exist where you're looking. So for example, there are a lot of towns in Massachusetts, and I can't bring it up because the one I've worked with the most, you have to be in a family history library, affiliate library. There was a direct tax in the 1770s in Massachusetts that has been transcribed and published, but it's also available online, original handwritten, as part of a series of, for example, the town of Middleton, Massachusetts has tax records for a couple decades in the 1760s to 80s. That can be a nice, again, you can sort of trace people as they come in and pay taxes for a number of years, and then you see something where it's then widow somebody, or it's the estate of somebody, or the heirs of someone. And so if you don't have a death record for that person, it can be a handy way to estimate when they died. So a lot of it is having to find it, a census substitute. But there are a lot of things where you get just lists of people. And as I said, I'll repeat the sort of list so that if you want to write this down. So it's tax lists. I talked last week about the city directories. In colonies like Massachusetts, you have the list of the men who've taken the freeman's oath. You will also get, and I didn't talk about this because I'm going to talk about some of the other church records at some point, you will get lists of people who are either eligible for communion or who have paid pew rents. And that can be another way to place your ancestor in a particular time and place. You get maps with landholder names. You get voting lists. You get school censuses. Most of those are very localized. They'll be for a particular town or county. And militia lists. In the American colonies before the Revolution, most men would have served in the local militia for defense against attacks from Native Americans, and just in general, that was the way they did things. Especially here in New England. I'm less certain about, I haven't done enough research down south to know if that was as close to universal as it was in New England. So, any questions at this point? Okay, one of the other things I will say, and I didn't really show you this, but Ancestry has tried to digitize records that go around those early censuses lost in the US, like in Delaware and New Jersey, and around 1890. So for example, early on, before they had much other than the census and Ancestry, they were starting to digitize city directories from about 1886 to 1894 to catch that gap around the 1890 census. So many of their early records were trying to fill in that slot. And they're still there. They haven't gone away. But that was in many ways the start of their city directory collection, was that kind of trying to fill in that gap. So any other questions?
BJ, what was the name of that, the website you were showing us after Scotland's Places? You went somewhere else.
Oh, I went to Scotland's People.
Okay, so it was Scotland's Places first and then Scotland's People.
Yes.
Okay.
The valuation rolls are at Scotland's People. The tax lists are at Scotland's Places.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, if you've got Scottish ancestors, poke around at that Scottish Places, because they have some of those tax lists. They've got some interesting information about things like, you know, they had people walking around in the late 19th century looking for all the names of every geographic bump, you know, and, you know, pile of stones.
Is that a paid subscription?
No, that's, at this point, that's free. It used to be, but I think it's now all free.
Thank you.
For a while, they did the thing that if you helped them transcribe stuff, you got free access. And otherwise, you had to pay for it. But I think they've made it all free since then.
Must have been easy to transcribe. They had beautiful handwriting.
I chose one that was not one of the difficult ones.
Oh.
Trust me. I transcribed a couple pages there that I'm still not sure that we got the right thing off the page. Another person and I worked at it, and some of them we went back and forth practically for hours on each name or other entry. So, but yeah, so I just wanted to show you sort of the range of things that you can look at to see if the person you're looking for is in the right place or is in a particular place. And most of these will then generate other records. You know, if you've got a tax list where they're paying a poll tax, it often means they then own land. That was often the requirement for being able to vote. And so that tells you that they were well enough off that they owned land that they probably left other records, for example. You know, and a lot of this comes in, you know, you're not having to do this for people who were born in 1888 and lived into the 20th century. These are things where you're going back before the good records start. And you're having to piece together multiple records to come to a conclusion. Does that make sense? Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
I'm not sure you consider this somewhat of a substitute, and I guess it really depends on, you know, where you live and who your people are. But in some cases, the main register, and in other states may also have a register. In some cases, that might be of use because it was an annual thing, but it's not really a list of everybody. It just depends on if they happen to hold certain positions. But for some people, that might turn out to be really useful.
Yeah, I will be talking about that. I'm going to talk about town reports at some time soon, and I'll probably be able to get that in as well, because it covers some of the same territory. But yeah, that's another place you will get direct, you know, that's one reason like some of those city directories are helpful, is that they will somewhere list, a lot of them will list the local government details, who does what job, you know, who oversees licensing hairdressers, who does the weights and measures testing, often are at the front of the directory. So it gives you an idea of how built up the local bureaucracy was. You know, if there is somebody overseeing licenses for something, that probably means there were, at one point, there were records of the licenses, and do those still exist? You know, so if you find that your great-grandmother or great-grandfather was licensed as a hairdresser / barber in Chicago, and there's someone who is overseeing those licenses, are they still in this Chicago City archive, or, you know, do they get thrown out after 10 years? I don't know, but that would be the sort of, question to ask.
Yeah, I remember seeing, and I think the first time I heard it, it surprised me, and I thought it was funny, but hearing somebody refer to dog licenses specifically as one of the resources to look for. And I think they were talking especially about the Irish. And I thought it was kind of funny, but it's kind of a neat resource too. And you never know. There's so many odd and unusual, unique.
Yeah, there are dog licenses. They're at Find My Past, which I don't currently have a subscription to, which is why I didn't pull them up. But again, it's 19th century records for Ireland that have a person and a place tied together. And they also tell you whether it's a male or female dog, whether it's a working dog or a pet. I think they may even tell you the name of the dog. I don't remember off the top of my head. But again, if you had, you know, if your Irish great-grandpa, you know, take a look and see if he owned a dog. Because, you know, it's, again, it's for two reasons. One is that you're getting the information. You're also, as I was talking about, you know, you're building up the entire picture of your ancestors' life and world. And, you know, did they have 3 sheepdogs because they were a shepherd and they needed them because they had a large herd of sheep? Or did they have 1 pet? So yeah, there are a lot of records that I hate to say some of them are just fun, but
They are.
some of them are fun. You you know, because again, you know, I would have, when I started doing this 20 plus years ago, who would have thought that there was 1 month where, you know, I was paying for a Find My Past subscription, because you can do a month at a time. And one day I just said, you know, I'm just going to run down every Irish name in my database and see if they owned a dog.
Did you find any?
Yes, because a couple of them were shepherds, and so had working sheepdogs. So there are some fun records there. So, but you know, what I wanted you to get out of this is that, you know, if you can't find a census, look and see what other records there might be that will put your ancestor in a particular place at a particular time, because then you have an idea of where else to look for records.
BJ?
Yeah.
Do any of these places have records that go back to the mid 17th century?
Yes. It varies considerably. Here in New England, there are records, town records and court records and vital records that go back into the 1600s with no problem.
I was thinking more of Ireland and Scotland. And
there are some, they're skimpier, especially in Ireland. But in Scotland, you do get some things going back. You get church registers going back that far, but it's hit or miss whether your ancestors were in a parish where they kept records. So, you know, I'm working on a one name study for what was my mother's maiden name, which is Leroyd, Learoyd, which a lot of you have seen me use as an example. And some of those Leroyds were in a parish in the West Riding of Yorkshire, where the records do go back into the early 1600s. They're not as complete as I'd like. There are a lot of cases, like there's several years where there are babies baptized, where it just has the baby's name and the baptismal date and no parents' names, which, yeah, it's just not what I would call a good record for. But, you know, I know that but I then know that they were in that parish, that the family with that name at that time. And often I'm able to find some other detail later on that ties that baby to somebody else. For example, when I found an Ashley Leroyd born in the early 1700s, I was not at all surprised to find that his mother's maiden name was Ashley, because it was such an unusual first name for the time. You know, nowadays it's a common girl's name, but you know, in 1717 or whenever this boy was born, it wasn't a common name for anybody. So a few days later, when I'm looking through the marriage records and I see that one of the Leroyds married a woman with the maiden name Ashley, I went, aha. And it turned out I was right. I found other records that confirmed that. So you will find some things. If you're looking in England, there is a book out from Pen and Sword about looking before 1830, about searching before 1837. There are actually two of them. There's one that sort of covers the whole timeline from when records start to 1837. And then there's another one called something like Tracing Your Georgian Ancestors that covers about 1650 or 1700 up to 1837, which is when civil registration started in England. But even that one that only goes back to about 1700 still has information about what goes back past that. So there are lots of records. It's just they are scarcer, and they don't necessarily give you the context. With, you get marriage records where it's just the two people's names and no parents' names, and so it's hard to then put them in a family. And because the records are just skimpy enough, you can't assume, something like Ashley Leroy, I can be pretty sure there aren't too many of them floating around. But when I'm looking for my Robert Jameson, even in the 1820s, or William Patterson at any time in Scottish history, I need something else other than the name to sort of connect the person to, in order to start. So whether it's the witnesses at his marriage or transactions he does with renting from his wife's family, I need something else to give it the context. But the records are there, and in many cases, they're often hard to read. You have to learn to read older handwriting. I don't want to discourage you, I'm just telling you that. And the other thing that happens more in New England than in Old England, when you get back into the 1600s, you get a lot of people who see having those ancestors as prestigious, and you get a lot of inflated claims about connections to each other and to ancestors who might have been important people. And you get some of the same things when you get back, like in Scotland, the whole clan system has been heavily romanticized, but you get people who try, they've got a James Campbell here in, Pennsylvania, backwoods Pennsylvania or Virginia in the 1700s, and they try to connect him with the son of one of the socially high status Campbells in Scotland, when the odds are pretty good that's not the case, just because the son, a legitimate son of somebody who was had a noble title, is probably not migrating to backwoods Virginia.
What I have is a bunch of Scottish prisoner of war that came to South Berwick, and my chances of finding them, I feel, are pretty small, since I think there's a lot of people looking into it and they're not getting anywhere either.
Well, that's kind of how I feel about some of the Mayflower people, is I really haven't done much original research on them, because there's so many other people looking for, so-and-so's or origins, that it's not going to do me much good. So I've concentrated on things where I'm about the only one doing it. But I think you might find that with some of the prisoner of war stuff, that you may find that you're getting into, there may be records on the British side of who they transported. There may be court records. Not sure. So yeah, I can see people are starting to leave, so I've chattered on lots. I apologize. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point.